As told, I'm the head of EU Policy and Research at the Future of Life Institute. I'm also in academia. I'm doing a PhD at KU Leuven, where a lot of my academically oriented research is. I try to combine both of them. I want to have reasonable policy impact, and I also want to study things rigorously, as academia allows you to do that and combine those two. So yeah, my topic is systemic risk from general purpose AI. I will firstly talk a little bit about the EU AI Act and how systemic risks come up there, because that gives a lot of motivation for my research. And then I will present one of my papers on a taxonomy of systemic risks, and then I will talk about another paper which is about mitigations of those systemic risks from general purpose AI. And I end up with a few thoughts on how people can contribute, especially thinking about the research communities, how they can contribute to reducing systemic risks from general purpose AI. Before I go there, I just wanted to take a quick moment to just reflect on my own life a little bit, because it's great to be talking with you here. And so I remember that back in, I think it was the 7th grade, when I changed the school. I grew up in basically a village. I was in a working class family, and I got into a better school back in Estonia, in Tallinn. And to the 7th grade, I went to this new school, and my mom, I think, bought me one of Nokia's, I think it was Nokia 5510. I think the first one here on the left, that was my first phone, if I remember correctly. And I remember being so afraid of using this. I was so embarrassed because the new school had, wealthy, rich kids, or at least some of them, and I thought that they would be, this phone looked ridiculous, and it was very cheap, and I was afraid of using it. So sometimes when my mom would call me, I would go in a corner and try to avoid anybody seeing me. But I think the next phone I had was the Nokia 3210, which is on the right, which I was a bit more happy about. Anyway, that's like, because I'm speaking here at your event, I just wanted to reflect on this memory that came to my mind when I was thinking about Nokia. I'm from originally from Estonia. I'm currently based in Brussels, so this connection with Estonia and Finland is still very strong. Anyway, let me move to the EU AI Act. So I'm assuming that some of you might know about the EU AI Act, but maybe others don't. So I want to say a few quick things about the EU AI Act, which is this regulation that the European Union has been working on for the last 4 years or so. Back in 2021, April, the European Commission released the first draft. And after that, a lot of negotiation happened over the years. And in August 2024, the AI Act entered into force. So what is the AI Act? Usually people say that it's a risk-based regulation to AI. So it essentially thinks of AI systems as having different risk categories. If you use AI for hiring and education, admitting somebody to educational institutions, those seem very risky. You could potentially put somebody's livelihood at stake with AI systems in those use case categories. So then it's called high risk AI system, and then a lot of obligations kick in. But suppose that instead you use an AI system for doing your kind of initial research brainstorming on, I don't know, responsible AI topics. That doesn't seem very risky, so that's low risk or doesn't even have any requirements. And that's essentially how the AI Act was drafted and was envisioned. This logic isn't necessarily super neat all the time. Like, what if you have something like a general purpose AI system, which doesn't have one specific use case, but can be adopted for many, many different use cases, some of which can be risky, some of which can be less risky. How do you deal with those kinds of AI systems? And that was also included in the AI Act. Initially, in the very early phases, it wasn't there, but over time, it was included. So general purpose AI is also captured there. And there's also another risk category, you could say, even though it's not envisioned in this high risk, low risk categorization, which is called systemic risk, which I'm going to talk about as well. And so what is systemic risk in the EU Act? So here's a definition that is, I think, in Article 3, which is the EU Act defines systemic risk as a risk that is specific to the high impact capabilities of general purpose AI models, having a significant impact on the union market due to their reach or due to actual or reasonably foreseeable negative effects on public health, safety, public security, fundamental rights, or the society as a whole that can be propagated at scale across the value chain. So this is the definition. It's quite long. You can see some of these elements. For example, general purpose AI is within the systemic risk definition. One could argue that that's not perfect to put it here, because surely systemic risk could be relevant for other kinds of AI systems or AI models as well, not just general purpose AI models. What if somebody uses, I don't suppose that we have a world government, and that world government uses facial recognition systems to surveil on its people and does it very effectively. Basically, the whole world is using that AI system and lots of cameras are everywhere. Well, that would not be a general purpose AI system, but it could potentially still be very large scale and potentially systemically risky. So, and there could be other examples. So that's something that you can discuss and debate whether it's reasonable to put general purpose AI into this definition. But other things to take a look at are this reach question, which is basically you have to have significant impact, significant reach, or concrete negative effects on institutions, basically, large scale risks to big sectors like health, safety, public security. And then one other thing here you can see is that it mentions that the risks can be propagated at scale across the value chain. And so general purpose AI maybe has this particular difference to some other AI systems, perhaps, is that the value chain is especially complicated. Maybe for other AI systems, it can also be complicated. Maybe one actor develops a data set, another actor does something else. But for general purpose AI, it can be even more complicated. So that's also mentioned here. So that's the definition of systemic risk in the EU Act. And there are some examples of systemic risks mentioned. You can go to recital 110, which talks about some of these examples. I brought out these 4 examples, which are also in the EU Code of Practice for general purpose AI, which I will also mention quickly soon. And these are cyber offense, CBRN, harmful manipulation, and loss of control. So cyber offense is defined as risks related to offensive cyber capabilities that could enable large-scale sophisticated cyber attacks, including on critical systems. CBRN is a chemical, biological, radiological, nuclear risks. And harmful manipulation is risks enabling the targeted distortion of the behavior of persons in a manner that causes or is reasonably likely to cause significant harm on a large scale. And then finally, loss of control is a risk related to the inability to oversee and control autonomous AI that may result in large-scale safety or security threats, or the realization of other systemic risks. So these are the risks and risk categories that have been prioritized in the EU Code of Practice for general purpose AI, which is a guideline to help providers of general purpose AI to comply with the EU Act. That particular section that talks about systemic risks from general purpose AI. And yeah, these have ended up being some of the priorities, but the taxonomy that I developed, which I will talk about in a moment, has more categories. But arguably there are considerations of how many resources we have, what risks are most likely, what risks are most severe, which ones have not been focused on enough, all kinds of practical considerations for why we might decide to include certain risk categories in a taxonomy over others when we are doing actual practical work of implementation of a law or regulation. There's also a general purpose AI definition in the EU AI Act. This is an AI model, including where such an AI model is trained with a large amount of data using self-supervision at scale that displays significant generality and is capable of competently performing a wide range of distinct tasks, regardless of the way the model is placed on the market, and that can be integrated into a variety of downstream systems or applications, except AI models that are used for research, development, or prototyping activities before they are placed on the market. So you can see in this definition, there's even an exception included where general purpose AI obligations don't apply. So for legal purposes, I think the regulators, policymakers were probably in a very challenging situation where they were discussing what should be exempt, what should not be exempt, and then they decided to make it very clear by including this exemption in the definition of general purpose AI. Even it doesn't really matter to the definition of general purpose AI itself, the technology. And the key components here highlighted are, for example, large amount of data being used, self-supervision, significant generality, and capability of competently performing a wide range of distinct tasks. These are probably the key components, and I'm not talking about these at length today, but I've published 2 papers on the topic of how to define general purpose AI for legal purposes. If people are interested, you can find our work on this particular topic as well. And what are these obligations for general purpose AI providers in the EU Act? So all general purpose AI model providers must provide technical documentation, instructions for use, comply with the copyright directive, and publish the summary about the content used for training. So this particular obligation applies to all general purpose AIs or all general purpose AI providers. Then there's this other obligation, which is or rather kind of this distinction when a general purpose AI model is provided as a free and open licensed general purpose AI model, then the providers only need to comply with copyright and publish the training data summary, except when they present a systemic risk. So final categorization here is that if you're a provider of general purpose AI models that do present a systemic risk, it doesn't matter where it's open or closed model, then in addition to all these general requirements for all general purpose AI model providers, now you also must conduct model evaluations, assess and mitigate possible systemic risks, track and report serious incidents, and ensure cybersecurity protections. And this particular set of obligations is highlighted in Article 55, and this is very particular to the largest, most capable general purpose AI models. So this doesn't apply to most everything that a lot of stakeholders could develop, but this applies to only a few, the biggest ones like, Gemini 3 right now we're talking about, or GPT-5, or these ones. And how does the EU Act identify systemic risks? Well, it has a couple of, or maybe you could say 3 approaches. So one is if technical tools, methodologies, indicators, benchmarks, if these identify that a general purpose AI model has high impact capabilities that could be considered systemically risky, well, then a particular model could be considered that. Another option is that there's commission or expert group or the scientific panel, for example, which is a new institution that is going to be set up very soon. If they identify that some general purpose AI model has such capabilities or impact, then it could also be considered systemically risky. But for current purposes, the simplest approach that the European Commission will use is considering how much cumulative amount of compute was used to train a general purpose AI model. And currently, and this is measured in floating point operations, And currently this is seen to be, if it's greater than 10 to the power 25, then a model will be considered systemically risky. Yeah, so those are the methods that can be used. Currently, we haven't heard any information about what kinds of models are designated as general purpose AI with systemic risk. There's no information about that. So far, people have been, when I say Gemini 3 and so on, these are the best guesses, because these are very powerful general purpose AI models, some of the best ones. They're very likely to be part of this, but we don't really know because nobody has discussed which ones are in scope and which ones are not. I also wanted to quickly raise, I already mentioned the code of practice as well. So the code of practice was basically, I would say, a pseudo standard. It's an intermediate version of a technical standard, which was decided for general purpose AI models to be currently a more feasible approach than having a technical standard, which might actually end up happening anyway in the future. But for now, there's a code of practice rather than a standard. And this was developed by independent experts. This was not developed by the EU AI office, the European Commission, lawyers. These were independent experts that were brought to develop it. I think it was 13 chairs and vice chairs in total, including Yoshio Bengio, who is one of the most well-known computer scientists in the world and Turing Award winner. He was responsible for, I think, the risk mitigation part of the code of practice. And there are other parts like risk assessment, risk mitigation, transparency, some other ones. And this was developed basically over a year. Now it exists. There's a long document where you can see all of the measures that have been discussed and all the commitments. And most of these big general purpose AI providers have signed up to this code of practice, indicating that they will want to use it, including, for example, XAI. I think Meta is probably the only one that hasn't signed up, and maybe also some Chinese model providers like DeepSeek also hasn't, but many others have that are relevant in this category. And what does the code of practice say exactly? Well, it talks about assessment and mitigation. Here's a very quick flow chart, basically indicating how signatories or these providers of general purpose AI models with systemic risk might go about assessing and mitigating the risks. First, they identify the relevant risks to their model, analyze it, evaluate the risk according to systemic risk acceptance criteria, which is in the code. And then they decide, based on this, whether the risk is acceptable or not. If it is acceptable, they can go ahead, develop the model, or make it available on the market. If it's not, then they have to put in mitigation measures to mitigate this, and then go again through the assessment process. That's kind of at a high level what the code of practice indicates this process should look like. If you're interested in the EU Act, you're very welcome to go to our website that we have set up, which is artificialintelligenceact.eu. There we have this AI Act Explorer, which talks at length, where you can go and check at length that all of these articles that I mentioned, Article 3, Article 55, Recital 1 and 10, whatever you're interested in, you can check those specific parts of the EU Act and look what it says exactly there, rather than going through the whole legal document, which is very lengthy and a lot of work. And you can also take a look at our compliance checker, which is this small, very simple tool to help companies figure out whether they might have obligations under the AI Act. This is not a legal tool, won't guarantee that with this you will know everything about the AI Act that you need to know, but it can help you start in case you're interested. All right, so let me now go to the taxonomy paper that I mentioned. So this is early work. It's a taxonomy of systemic risks from general purpose AI. This has been published as a preprint, so you can read it. It's available online, but it's not submitted into a journal yet. There's still some work to do to make it final. And this is work together with Carlos Ignacio Gutierrez, Daniel Gappi, Lode Lauert, Atusa Kazirzadeh, Luisa Velasco, Peter Slattery, and Karina Brunkel. And basically, like, one of my interests with this taxonomy was to essentially think about what kind of risks might the EU Act, when it comes to general purpose AI and systemic risks, focus on. And this was motivated by the fact that lots of people, lots of experts are starting to talk more and more about not just how AI systems can cause harm to individuals, but also to society as a whole. For example, there's a paper by Natalie Smucha, which distinguishes between individual harms, group level harms, and society as a whole, systemic risk types of harms. And one specific example we might think about is, you can think about like an AI system that is meant to influence somebody's voting behavior, say reduce or increase a particular person's desire to vote by a little bit. And arguably, this doesn't really make much of a difference in terms of like harming somebody individually. There's no health-related harm that this commits to an individual. But overall, if there's many people, if there's large amount of people that are affected by this impact by this AI, then overall potentially elections could be changed. And if a bad leader or a different leader becomes the leader of a country, that could have a huge amount of impact. It could potentially mean certain institutions could be diminished or deteriorated or whatever. So that might be an example of where, in this particular case, individuals maybe are not actually harmed, but overall the harm is very significant for institutions or for the whole society. And then there's another paper by Dan Hendricks and colleagues who talk about things like competition incentivizing rushed AI development and over-reliance on autonomous systems, enabling automated warfare, and prioritizing corporate profits over safety. And they talk about catastrophic harms, talk about large-scale harms, things like that. Also, Anthony Aguera has a paper that where he specifically mentions that highly capable general purpose AI systems pose many systemic risks. And in this taxonomy, we really refer to the EU Act's definition, and we don't develop our own definition, and we don't talk about any other definitions that there might be about systemic risks, including, for example, from the financial industry, where systemic risks have been discussed quite a bit. But we just refer to the EU Act because it's one of the most influential pieces of definitions in the EU and in the world, to be honest. And this basically equates to large-scale risk. Systemic risk is large-scale risk. Of course, there will be lots of debates over what counts as large-scale and which doesn't, but that's essentially what we assumed in the paper. I want to immediately share with you the findings in this paper. And here we identified a lot of categories of 13 categories in total of systemic risks, and we described them. And we also have 50 categories of sources of systemic risks. And from these categories here are control, democracy, discrimination, economic impacts, environmental impacts, fundamental rights, governance-related risks, harms to non-human animals, information-related harms, irreversible changes, power-related harms, security, warfare-related risks. And how do we exactly find these 13 categories? So we conducted a systematic review. And for this systematic review, we firstly created a long list of keywords. And these keywords were essentially things like large-scale risk, societal level harm, catastrophic risk, existential risk, all kinds of terms that me and my co-authors could come up with when it comes to large-scale risk, essentially. And we used these terms, and we used several databases, and we tried to find as many papers as we could on those topics. And essentially, we took this kind of empirical approach rather than having a conceptual focus on what kind of risks are most likely or which kinds of risks are most plausible and which ones should be focused on and so on. We took an empirical approach where we just wanted to know what are the risk categories that academics talk about. And we identified all these papers, and we went through the papers, tried to see what types of harms are academics talking about when they're talking about things that could be called as systemic risk or large-scale risk. And we found, sometimes we would find a paper where an author talks about privacy risk. They talk about bias to an individual or something like that. And this would, to us, indicate, well, they're not talking about large-scale risk. But in another case where an author will be talking about a lot of people's privacy being violated or leading to mass surveillance and things like that, then we would notice that, hey, here we're talking about large-scale risk. It's not just to an individual in terms of their privacy violation, but it's to whole societies, potentially. And here on this flowchart, you can see what we found. We found 1,781 records or documents from databases. We removed lots of duplicates, screened 1,452, excluded 1,340 among those, then assessed with our eligibility criteria. We assessed 112 and ended up finding some of these that, for example, they didn't even talk about risks, or they didn't discuss large-scale risks, or they didn't focus on AI. They talked about some other emerging technology, didn't describe the risks, or we couldn't find the full text, or it was not academic document. And then we ended up with 86 papers that we went through in detail and reviewed fully. And so, as I mentioned, there were 13 categories of these risks, and among those you could find operational concerns like control and security, but you could also find more societal things like democracy and fundamental rights, risks to institutions, and you could find existential considerations such as irreversible changes to human societies. There are lots of different types of categories of risks there. And one thing that we highlight in the paper is that you can really see that systemic risks can manifest in different ways. Like they can have different sources of risk. And usually they don't have one single source of risk. Maybe there are some systemic risks related to, say, warfare or some other ones that could potentially have a clear source of risk, or they could have a one-off incident. A malicious actor does something bad with a bomb that was made with the help of an AI system or something like that. But usually these systemic risks are not like that. They are rather cumulative, aggregate effects. They are more like climate change or economic externalities. They're not sudden events, one big explosion happening because of one concrete bad actor, but they're more messy, more complicated to understand. And definitely, in order to better understand these kinds of risks, we need to study better methods in particular that could help assess societal level impacts. So I think there's lots of methods that help us understand more simple risks. What about these societal level risks, these messy, gradual, cumulative risks? How do we assess those? How do we study those? I think a lot more research is required for that. And finally, regarding the taxonomy paper, some of the strengths and limitations we highlight. Strengths are, it's one of the first systematic attempts. It's quite rigorous. It uses a systematic review rather than a narrative review or ad hoc random categorization, which many other taxonomies might do in the AI space. It offers detailed documentation. You can see what kind of keywords we used exactly, what databases we used, what are some of the reasons we excluded some papers. And it also aligns with the EU Act definitions and concepts, and it's policy relevant in that sense. But there are limitations. We use limited number of databases. Many of these documents are not peer-reviewed documents, so we made a decision to include that anyway, because we're not necessarily interested in making a very firm decision on whether those risk categories are likely or not, but we wanted to see what academics talk about and think about. We might have missed important keywords. I mentioned we brainstormed lots of these keywords, and many of the authors in this paper have lots of experience in the field, but we might have missed important keywords. I also earlier talked about how making a judgment about whether some risk is systemic risk or not, whether it's large scale or not, is somewhat subjective. How do you really decide whether it's large enough to be in that category? And then finally, because this paper is still not completely finalized, our categorization, our view of the papers has been relatively rapid. We can go much deeper. We can do a much more thorough job at it. Now I want to turn to another paper. This is called Effective Mitigations for Systemic Risks from General Purpose AI. It was co-authored together with Anna-Mika Brauer, Tim Schreier, Noemi Trexler, Valeria Bulignano, and Rishi Bomasani. And motivation for this paper also came through the EU Act because, for example, the code of practice that I mentioned earlier, it includes mitigation measures, some preliminary mitigation measures that companies could use, and it was supposed to include them. It was supposed to focus on them. So we wanted to provide some rigorous input into this process while being policy relevant also. So I already mentioned that there are many experts, many people who are already discussing systemic risk types of risks a lot and understand that general purpose AI models can pose risks that are far beyond individual risks, are much larger impacts on society as a whole. And this, I think there is some emerging literature on this topic, and more people starting to talk about that. But despite this, current mitigation approaches remain understudied. We really haven't found anything or many things that are quite similar to what we did in this research. So we have seen mitigation frameworks, including ethics guidelines for trustworthy AI, like the one offered years ago by the EU AI high-level expert group. There are algorithmic preparedness principles, safety processes, technical risk mitigation approaches. And there's model deployment guidance, for example, by Partnership on AI, risk management standards. These kind of things are being developed, and that's great, but they lack systematic assessment of intervention effectiveness. Which measures are effective, or which measures are perceived to be effective? And the only study we found when we did this work examining expert consensus on AI safety practices was by Schuett and authors from 2023. But that particular study focused broadly on artificial general intelligence rather than specific systemic risks, which we wanted to focus. So we didn't find much, so that we were motivated to study this on our own. And again, I want to show you the findings quickly. So if you go to the preprint that is available publicly, you can see all the definitions for these measures that are listed here. But we basically found that some of the top measures by experts were third-party pre-deployment model audits. That was seen one of the most effective, or perceived to be one of the most effective, safety incident reports and security information sharing, whistleblower protections, pre-deployment risk assessments, and risk-focused governance structures. And I can just maybe like some of these seem kind of intuitive what they are, like safety incident reports, that's intuitive, whistleblower protections, that's intuitive. but risk-focused governance structures. Here in particular, we thought about things like boards, like you have seen AI ethics boards, things like that, chief risk officers, internal audit teams, all of those kinds of things together. Earlier, we organized a workshop where we found that if we assess some of those individually, for example, we would ask experts about ethics boards, then they would not count those as very effective, but all of those together in a structured way, they saw as more effective, and that's why it reached quite good ratings, favorable ratings. But there's lots of other things you can see here. If you go down the categories here, you can notice that some of the things that are more technical, like unlearning techniques or harmlessness training or fine-tuning restrictions, things like that are more technical than, for example, whistleblowing, more societal or social technical, I would say. These ones are seen as more effective, and single, more technical techniques, those have been seen less effective in our survey. Okay, what was our methodology? Now, so first of all, we did literature search. So we tried to go through, identify different risk mitigation measures for general purpose AI providers, and we found them from, for example, Google DeepMind's safety framework, OpenAI's model card, and places like that, but also academic papers, policy documents, all kinds of different places, and went through them and identified a long list of these interventions. I think initially one of the first drafts we had more than 100 interventions. But obviously it's not possible to ask from AI safety experts and other experts to answer a questionnaire which assesses 100 plus interventions. So we tested out a smaller subset of it. We organized a workshop at the Center for Human Compatible AI conference, and we got lots of feedback from there, and we refined this list and ended up with 27 interventions that we asked experts to evaluate. And then we developed a survey where we asked these experts to quantitatively assess the perceived effectiveness of each risk mitigation measure, while also answering qualitative questions, answering what is the reason behind these this quantitative evaluation. And we used what is called purposeful sampling. We basically wanted to find experts that are truly experts in specific fields like AI safety, critical infrastructure and AI, democratic process and AI, chemical, biological, radiological and nuclear risks, and discrimination and bias. And we send out surveys to 303 experts. We ended up getting, of course, much fewer responses, but still quite a good amount. I think we got 76 respondents overall, and from each category quite a few. And like I shared the findings already, but maybe one kind of, if we take a step back and look at it more broadly, we can see that the experts thought that transparency is very important. External scrutiny, like in the case of third-party evaluations, is very important, and proactive risk assessment. So you don't do risk assessment only very late, but you start doing risk assessments already quite early. And I mentioned the safety incident reporting and third-party pre-deployment. Those were some of the main, the most effective measures that experts saw. And one interesting thing we found was we asked from the experts every time how feasible technically these measures are, the 27 that we mentioned. And all of them were seen as very technically feasible. Like some of them received very, very high scores, and like the worst still received 91% feasibility rating. So experts really saw these as very feasible. And finally, I want to mention what were some of the strengths and limitations of this study. So strengths definitely were we asked for quantitative ratings, but with extensive qualitative insights. We have over, I think, 100 pages of material with all kinds of qualitative insights into all of these different measures. So we got loads of those. I think the people who responded to our survey, they're highly qualified experts. Our list was 27. We did make it into shorter, but it's quite comprehensive. It's rare to, I think, see surveys that are this comprehensive. It's also highly policy relevant. I mentioned the UA Act and how it's focused on that. And you can find in the code of practice, there's mentions of technical mitigation measures. And we are also very transparent about what our sample is, what the characteristics of those are, potential biases. I think that's also a strength. But there are limitations, of course. Firstly, I would say this study is about expert opinion. And expert opinion is not necessarily, doesn't necessarily correlate perfectly with what is actually the case. So we might be interested in how effective whistleblowing actually is, not just what experts think how effective they are. So that can be a limitation. We should definitely study more, not just opinions, but also real effectiveness. The sample may not be fully representative. I think if you look into some of the details, I think we got less input from industry than we got from academia, for example. We also assume that these measures can be required legally. So in the early version of our study, we asked people for feasibility and how effective these measures could be and so on. And a lot of people started responding that they don't think that these are effective because they don't envision that these could be mandated or anybody could actually do them. And so we are assuming regulation here. And then some people also point out that we didn't provide detailed scenarios of the risks, so people couldn't really foresee perfectly, or they couldn't envision how exactly the systemic risks would be mitigated by the measures and so on. And some people also in our feedback provided comments that we haven't considered the full costs of implementing some of these mitigation measures. So we do try to talk about the effectiveness, of course. We try to talk about technical feasibility. What about some of the other costs? We didn't, focus on how expensive it would be for companies to implement and so on. And our response rate was not super high, even though it was for this kind of survey. I think it's reasonably okay. And finally, I'll go through this quickly. I think we're running out of time now. So I also wanted to share very briefly how people in the scientific community could contribute. And one thing I would recommend is learn about the EU AI office. The EU AI office has lots of interesting materials coming out. They're asking for support. They're publishing new guidelines. There's so much to learn about them. And I'm sure some of the expertise that this community has could be very, very valuable to the AI office. Secondly, you can do AI safety research. Some of this AI safety research can be directly relevant for the AI office. And sometimes the AI office is asking for experts to provide input and do this AI safety research. So recently, there was a launch by the AI office of a 9 million euro general purpose AI safety tender, which mentioned many of these risk categories on systemic risks that I talked about. I think the application for this has passed, but there might be other opportunities. And in any case, doing research on this topic will definitely be of interest to a lot of people in the AI office and elsewhere. And then finally, I wanted to mention this new institution that is being set up. I don't know when it exactly will be launched, but it might be early next year already, which is called the EU Scientific Panel. So this is a panel of independent experts who are going to support the AI office when it comes to general purpose AI and systemic risk implementation in the UA Act. they can help, for example, bring attention to new general purpose AI models that might be systemically risky. So that's also a thing to be on the lookout for. Okay, thank you so much for your patience. Thank you so much for your time. And if you're interested in learning more about the EU Act, you're welcome to check out our bi-weekly newsletter that we have been publishing for the last couple of years. Yeah, thank you.